Hello, Crimestituents. I hope you're doing well today. I need to apologize in advance. It is a stormy session of Crime in Congress. I am recording in the middle of a classic Arlington torrential downpour that will hopefully only last a few minutes. But if you hear some thunderclaps, if you hear that rain pitter-pattering, I can only do so much here. This is my only chance to record before this episode hits your ears. So we are going to gavel in a stormy session of Crime in Congress today. I also have to talk about last episode. Y'all, my intro aged like absolute milk. A few things. First, Taylor did not announce Reputation Taylor's version. In fact, she announced that we are never getting Reputation Taylor's version, that she hasn't even recorded it and has no intentions to record it. Am I happy that she's got her masters back? Of course. They are home where they belong. Am I abundantly sad that we will never get to hear a more grown-up version of Reputation? Yes. I'm in mourning, hence me wearing black today. It is sad. A sad time for the Swiftie community, even though it's a very, very, very happy time for Taylor. And I love that I can listen to the old versions of the songs now because nothing is as special as the shaky notes in the original Last Kiss version. So, good things. I'm being dramatic. Of course, this is Crime in Congress. We're always a bit dramatic here. But I'm still recovering from the announcement that we will never get a Reputation Taylor's version, as I'm sure all of you are as well. Oh, there's that thunder. Gonna be an interesting episode, folks. I also am no longer under contract on a house, and that is not because I closed, that is because I walked away. I know I said last episode that I was feeling optimistic about working with the sellers. That did not pan out. And so I am in my rental for the foreseeable future, listening to non-Reputation Taylor's version songs. And you know what? That's just got to be okay for now. In other news, I just got back from San Francisco. It was my first time in California, which was great. I didn't really get to do much tourism, but it was fun to be there. I didn't realize how chilly San Francisco is at this time of year. I did not bring a sweater, and I should have brought a sweater, but it was a good time. So hello to our San Francisconian Crimestituents. That's a mouthful. I was in your area and loved it. All right, without further ado, hi, I'm Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. Thomas Carmichael Hindman, who I'm going to call TC or Hindman for the remainder of this session, was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in January 1828 to parents Thomas Hindman Sr. and Sally Holt Hindman. He was the fifth of 6 children, and according to the stories the Hindmans would tell themselves, TC was the first white male ever born in Knoxville. The family was of Scottish and English descent, with his father having served in the War of 1812. His father started off as a planter, but in 1832 he took a government job serving as a federal agent for the Creek Nation. For this job, they had to move to Jacksonville, Alabama, that same year. And his father traveled quite a bit for this position and actually became a quartermaster along the Trail of Tears. He would get doged only a few years later, though, and in 1841 the family moved to Ripley, Mississippi, where they purchased a rather large cotton plantation to live and work on. It is unclear to me whether the family owned slaves, but I believe they did, given everything else we know about them. TC would have been 13 at the time of this move, but he didn't actually move with the family initially. At this time, he was staying with relatives and studying at the Lawrenceville Classical Institute in New Jersey, from which he graduated with honors and as the salutatorian in 1846, according to his official congressional biography. Other sources indicate that he may have graduated a few years earlier, but I'm going to go with what Congress has to say on this one. This school emphasized learning Greek and Latin, math, history, and debate, and was religious. According to a book on his life called Lion of the South, he was likely hazed during his time at this school. Once he made his way to Mississippi, TC assisted with farming and began studying law. Much like Kim Kardashian, he didn't go to law school, but instead studied under a prominent local attorney named Orlando Davis. His father got involved in politics himself while living in Mississippi, leading the state's Whig Party and serving as a delegate to a convention that promoted infrastructure projects in the South and West. He was also an executive committee member of the local Henry Clay Club. TC's law studies had to be put on hold for a minute, though, because a little thing called the Mexican-American War broke out. Fun fact, in Mexico, this is referred to as the United States intervention in Mexico. In case you need a refresher, the Mexican-American War began on April 25th, 1846, when the United States invaded Mexico. This happened because America had annexed the state of Texas 1 year prior, but Mexico refused to recognize U.S. ownership and still considered Texas its territory. They were having a little lovers' quarrel over the state of Texas. We have a bit of a love triangle going on here. After the 1836 Texas Revolution, the Republic of Texas was an independent country, but according to U.S. history, most of its citizens wanted to join the United States. The United States was able to annex Texas because of the treaties of Velasco, which made Texas an independent state, signed by President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna after he was captured during the Texas Revolution. But Mexico refused to recognize that treaty, thus beginning the Mexican-American War. Was that whole thing an oversimplification? Absolutely. But you didn't come here for a deep history lesson. You came here to figure out what the heck happened to General Hindman. I promise we are getting to that. In 1846, then President James Knox Polk ordered states to gather 50,000 volunteers for the war. In response, Mississippi Governor Albert G. Brown created companies throughout his state, and a sprightly Hindman was eager to share his father's honorable status as a war veteran and put his law education on hold to volunteer. He joined the 2nd Mississippi Regiment under Colonel Clark and was involved in raising the company out of Tippah County. I think it's Tippah County, maybe Tippah County. Sorry to my Mississippi folks if I'm getting this wrong. He would rise through the ranks while serving for the duration of the war, becoming a lieutenant and then eventually captain of his company, which is an impressive resume for such a young man. According to Wikipedia, so grain of salt, y'all, his older brother Robert also joined the same infantry unit, but was discharged for medical reasons after getting smallpox. The unit trained at Camp McClung in Vicksburg, Mississippi in January 1847, and then was transferred to New Orleans, Louisiana. The unit would move around quite a bit, serving at the mouth of the Rio Grande, Saltillo, and in Buena Vista, though they served there after the infamous Battle of Buena Vista. In total, the unit did not see much by way of combat. However, they had a different battle to fight: disease. The cold temps in January 1847 led to many soldiers dying of the flu, pneumonia, and the cold plague. By June of that year, 167 men in his company had died. 134 were discharged, which we can assume was mostly for medical reasons. And 38 deserted completely, went AWOL. The Mexican-American War ended on February 2nd, 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which gave the United States half of Mexico's territory, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, portions of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. In exchange, the United States paid a meager $15 million to Mexico. I'm pretty sure there are houses in Arlington worth that much. and assumed just over $3 million worth of its debts. This treaty is also what established the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas and gave Mexicans living in these territories legal status as American citizens, although, because of racial bias, they were not always treated as equal American citizens. Hindman would return home after the war, where he would pass the bar exam in 1851, go TC, it's not an easy thing to do, and begin a career as a lawyer in the town where his family lived, namely Ripley. His brother, Robert, would face a different fate. Unfortunately, after a dispute with a man named William Faulkner over him trying to block Robert from joining the Ripley section of the Sons of Temperance, he was fatally stabbed, and the man was acquitted because Robert had a gun, and therefore it was an act of self-defense. People were just dying left and right in the 1800s over essentially nothing. Because of this, Faulkner and TC dueled one another, because of course they did, in a gunfight, but no one had any injuries. In a move that can best be described as petty, though, TC ended up joining the Ripley chapter of the Sons of Temperance himself and served as recording secretary. He really said, fine, you're going to try to block my brother and then kill my brother over this. I'm going to turn around and do what he never got the opportunity to do, just to spite you. This is also when he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and begin a political career. Because what else is a lawyer and a veteran going to do in the 1800s? It's not like he could, start a podcast. He started out in statewide politics, as many do, and was elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives, where he served from 1853 to 1854, representing Tippah County. During his tenure, he was appointed to the Judiciary Committee and supported tax and education reform, reforms to the Chancery Court system, and, disappointingly, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required all escaped slaves to be returned to their enslaver and even forced people living in free states that didn't acknowledge slavery to comply. This bill added fuel to the fire that would become the Civil War, which we'll get to in a bit. TC had bigger political ambitions than the state legislature, but didn't feel as though there was room for him to continue moving up in the state of Mississippi. That's why he decided, after his term was up in 1854, to pack up and move to Arkansas. At this time, Arkansas was rather politically turbulent and ripe for a young new political talent. He resumed his law practice and developed a reputation of being in favor of Helena, Arkansas's economic development and against the Know Nothings Party, which who would give themselves the name Know Nothing Party? That is just a comms nightmare waiting to happen. I feel like if they had a singular woman helping form the Know Nothings Party, they would have come up with a better name, like the Know Everything Party. I mean, just spitballing here, but why would you name yourself after a state of ignorance? I have no idea. Anyway, Hindman probably would have agreed with me. And he described the Know Nothings as pestilent fanatics because of their anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic stances. In fact, Hindman and his bestie John Palmer, another lawyer, started a Democratic Association in Arkansas with the goal of defeating the Know Nothings. Hindman and another man, Patrick Cleburne, would purchase the Democratic Star newspaper as well. So he's getting his foothold in Arkansas politics. Cleburne and Hindman's joint hatred of the Know Nothings was more than political, though. Like many disputes between men at this time, it turned violent. They actually got in a street fight with party members, and both suffered gunshot wounds. Obviously, this dispute ended up in court, but both Cleburne and TC were exonerated, and this fight catapulted TC onto the political scene, with people seeing him as a Democratic leader and loving his willingness to quite literally fight the Know Nothing Party at every turn. In 1857, TC would become two things: the editor of the Helena States Rights Democratic paper and the undisputed leader of the Democrats in East Arkansas. When he launched his 1858 congressional campaign, he didn't really face any challengers. He easily won the nomination at the Democratic Convention that year. There were other names on the ballot, but he was the clear frontrunner. Apparently, according to one source that I read, he had run for the seat the few years before in 1856, but I didn't find much information on that run. Then, after winning the nomination, he went on to face Republican William M. Crosby and completely demolished him in the polls. I mean, demolished. Crosby received just shy of 3,000 votes, and TC got more than 18,000. He was officially Congressman Hindman, and he was headed to the nation's capital, serving in the 36th Congress from March 4th, 1859 to March 3rd, 1861. I was able to find information on two bills that he introduced during his time in office. The first was H.R. 502, which was a bill that would delegate certain rail logistics to the federal government. Real riveting stuff. But it does kind of harken back to his reputation of being in favor of economic development and growth in Helena. He was an infrastructure king. The second was far more controversial. He was a member of the Committee of 33, which was a special committee formed in response to South Carolina's threat to secede from the Union after Abraham Lincoln was elected. The goal of this committee was to essentially avoid a civil war. Spoiler, it was not successful. As part of his work on this committee, TC introed a constitutional amendment, bold stuff, that would do the following: affirm slaveholders' property rights, add federal protections for slavery in D.C. and U.S. territories, give states control over whether they allowed slavery in their own states, allow for free passage of slaves through free states, and deny federal representation for states that refuse to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, among other provisions. This bill was called a compromise resolution, but it sounds to me like the pro-slavery faction was basically getting everything it wanted. I guess it would have implemented state sovereignty over slavery, and that would have done a little bit to make the anti-slavery people happy. This was a garbage bill from start to finish. Obvi, though, this bill did not pass, and that is a good thing. Despite an attempt from the Arkansas political family, I say family in quotes, to block TC's re-election in 1860, TC won that race. However, he wouldn't end up assuming his seat because something else was brewing that would define not just the 1860s, but the whole of American history: the Civil War. As the Union cracked, Hindman was not the kind of guy standing around suggesting that cooler heads prevail. No. He was the guy fanning the flames with a Confederate flag and a gun. Arkansas's most vocal secessionist, Hindman was what historians politely call a fire eater, and what his critics probably called a problem and racist with a mustache. In 1861, when Arkansas voted 65-5 to secede, Hindman wasn't pacing behind the scenes. He was watching from the gallery like it was opening night on Broadway, or like it was opening night for the Eras Tour. And it kind of was. Within days, he left Congress behind because clearly compromise wasn't in vogue anymore, and he was ready to fight. Back home in Helena, Hindman wasted no time. He began raising a Confederate regiment and asked the state for muskets, clothing, and rations. His reason? Quote, so that my men could fight for our country. Now, which country he meant kind of depends on your politics. He was not fighting for the U.S., he was fighting for the Confederacy. By June 1st, 1861, he had 10 companies. 6 in Helena, 4 in Pine Bluff. And 5 of those companies immediately told Hindman, yeah, we're not leaving the state, but thanks anyway. Though, like pretty much everything else in the story, that didn't stop him. He followed orders to report to Richmond, Virginia. His shiny new Confederate bosses had big plans for this loud guy from Arkansas. By September, he'd been promoted to brigadier general, just in time for the spectacular disaster that was the Kentucky campaign, followed closely by the bloodbath at Shiloh, where Hindman took a hit and got himself slightly wounded, which I guess in Civil War terms means he got slightly lucky. But Hindman wasn't done, far from it. After licking his wounds, he got bumped up to Major General and sent back west to command the Trans-Mississippi Department. And what did he find when he rolled into Little Rock? Well, imagine trying to defend a state with a sack of potatoes, half a gun, and no money. That's essentially what he had. In his own words, bearer of soldiers, penniless, defenseless, and dreadfully exposed. Which is kind of ironic because that's also how most of his soldiers would later describe his leadership, but that's neither here nor there. To salvage this very bleak situation for the Confederacy, Hindman unleashed a flurry of martial law madness, conscription, guerrilla warfare, military tribunals, and even a good old-fashioned propaganda campaign to make the Union Army think Arkansas was crawling with soldiers. Kind of smart, actually. But, shockingly, it was not far from it. But the deception worked, although briefly. The Union forces, convinced they didn't have a strong enough supply line, backed off their march to Little Rock and rerouted to Helena. Meanwhile, Hindman, high on his own audacity, commandeered Texas troops en route to Virginia and rerouted them back to Arkansas. Richmond was not amused. The public wasn't either. The backlash came fast and loud. Citizens, newspapers, and even his own colleagues demanded he be removed. Enter Theophilus H. Holmes, a man best known in history for his stunning mediocrity. Richmond sent Holmes to replace Hindman in 1862, but Hindman, ever the political operator, convinced Holmes to give him a field command anyway. This all went down in the month of August. And it worked. So off Hindman went to northern Arkansas, ready to pull one over on the Union again. He had a shot. He caught the Union Army divided. But instead of attacking, Hindman did something no one expected. He hesitated. He dug in at Prairie Grove, let the Union Army recombine, and got beat back like a bad poker bluff. Another missed opportunity. Another Confederate retreat. Story of his life. After that, Hindman was shuffled back across the Mississippi where he fought at Chickamauga, which is very fun to say, got shot in the neck, which is less fun to say, and somehow survived. He then joined General Pat Cleburne for the Atlanta campaign, fighting from Dalton to Kennesaw Mountain. There, on July 4th, 1864, fate didn't need a bullet to get to him. A tree branch clocked him in the eye and knocked him off his horse. Yes, a tree branch. Because sometimes even nature gets sick of your shit. The injury took him out of the war. He moved through Atlanta, then Macon, all the while angling for a return to command. He asked for a transfer back west. The Confederate War Department said no, but Jefferson Davis gave him a leave of absence instead. On his way to Texas, tragedy struck. His young daughter Sally died near Meridian, Mississippi. It was the one wound that Hindman couldn't heal. He arrived in San Antonio, where he was hailed as a hero by locals who either loved a good war story or had zero idea what he'd actually done. He stayed there through the final months of the war. When the Confederacy officially surrendered in May 1865, Hindman cowered. He fled to Mexico, like many other ex-Confederates, seeking asylum and waiting for the heat to die down. Isn't it ironic that he was seeking asylum in the same country that he fought in war? I mean, the irony is just so thick there. After fleeing the collapse of the Confederacy, Thomas C. Hindman resurfaced in the Mexican town of Carlota, where he tried to reinvent himself as a coffee planter and a lawyer, because apparently war crimes and cappuccinos go hand in hand. He was one of many Confederate refugees sulking south of the border, trying to make peace with the fact that their side had, well, lost. By April 1867, Hindman must have decided the heat in Mexico wasn't worth it, because he packed up his ambition and probably a few coffee beans and headed back to Arkansas. He confidently applied for a presidential pardon from Andrew Johnson, hoping to hit the restart button on all of his past crimes and past political life. But Johnson, in a rare moment of drawing a line, said no. Hindman's was one of the few applications for pardon that got slapped with a big red deny. You'd think that would stop most people, but not Hindman. He went right back to doing what he did best, stirring the political pot. Even though he was ineligible to hold office because of his status in the Confederacy, he publicly opposed the Reconstruction Constitution, immediately putting himself in the crosshairs of Reconstruction authorities. And they didn't just shake their heads. They revived a treason indictment against him and arrested him for treason. Still, Hindman didn't shut up. If anything, he doubled down. He took to the political circuit, giving speeches, shaking hands, and somehow managed to build an unlikely coalition between newly freed Black voters and white Democrats. The same guy who once fought for the Confederacy was now aligning himself with people who only a few years earlier had been enslaved. Why? Political survival, strategy, a genuine change of heart? We'll never really know for sure. But whatever it was, it worked, at least for a while. Because Thomas Hindman never met a system he couldn't challenge, or a revolution he didn't want to lead. But his final battle was not too far away. Hindman was sitting at his home in Helena, Arkansas on the evening of September 27, 1868, around 10 o'clock p.m., which, for the record, is my bedtime. He was surrounded by family and smoking his pipe. I get the sense that this was just a run-of-the-mill evening for the Hindmans. Maybe swapping gossip, side-eyeing each other over who forgot to, blow out the lamp last night, whatever drama was like in this time. Perhaps they were even discussing the headline drama of the day. A new indictment against John Surratt, a former Confederate spy accused of helping John Wilkes Booth assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. Casual dinner talk, really. In my house it is. His mother, Mary Surratt, had already achieved the dubious honor of being the first woman executed by the federal government, convicted of conspiracy to assassinate the president. Note to self, add that one to the to-be-covered list. Anyway, they were sitting around, probably talking about espionage, executions, other lighthearted topics, when bam, and then bam again. Because in an instant, everything changed. And I do mean everything. A loud series of bangs shattered the peace, followed by a literal spray of blood and Hindman's left hand flying across the room as if it was trying to flee the scene first. Not exactly what you expect when you're just vibing in the parlor with your kids, right? Amid shattered glass from a shot-to-hell window, the family likely did what any of us would do when faced with a sudden explosion of gore in the living room. Scream. But the real horror? That came when the blood started revealing two massive buckshot wounds to Hindman's throat. For those of you who, like me, are not fluent in 19th century ammo, A buckshot is a shotgun load used to take down large game, or, I guess, technically, retired Confederate generals. It was very clear that someone wasn't just mad at Hindman. They were out to end him. And they succeeded. After a grueling 8 hours, during which we can assume frantic and probably not very sterile medical care was attempted, Hindman died on the morning of September 28th. Before his death, he gave a farewell speech from his front porch because people were just built different back then. Can you imagine? You have gunshot wounds to the neck, you're bleeding out, and you're like, this is the perfect time for me to give a speech. No way, but that's the politician in him, I guess. It blows my mind. Anyway, he said that his recent political skirmish with a man named Powell Clayton might have been the reason for his murder, which is such a dramatic thing to do, to implicate someone in your own murder. Like, this man is a political mastermind. And he said, quote, "I do not know who killed me, but I can say whoever it was, I forgive him," which, to his credit, is an admirable way to end things, whether or not he meant it. He died later on the lounge after becoming too weak to continue speaking. He left behind his wife and 3 children, Blanche, TC, and Bisco. Honestly, kind of love these names. Naming one kid after the dad, and then one of the kids, Bisco, after the mom's maiden name, feels surprisingly modern. And Blanche is just absolutely adorable. $10 says she grew up to write stern letters and take zero nonsense. The newspapers would run that Hindman died a, quote, able and distinguished man whose short but splendid career impacted Arkansas in a lasting way. Almost immediately after the shots rang out, police set their sights on a suspect, George Robbins. Now here's where things get foggy. All I could dig up on this guy was that he served under Hindman at one point and had once been a passenger aboard the Shreve, which is a railroad line connecting Shreveport, Louisiana to Benton, Arkansas. So yes, Robbins was on a train, which was apparently enough to get him arrested. I searched high and low, mostly through archival newspapers that seem to have been typeset by like someone who was half asleep, and found no clear motive or explanation for why Robbins was singled out. But based on newspaper speculation, here's what we know. A, the murder was politically motivated, and B, Robbins did it. Those were the 2 main ideas floating around. And the leap from one to the other seems to be, well, Hindman was political and Robbins existed in his orbit. It's possible Robbins had opposing political views, which wouldn't have been hard. Hindman had a reputation for being a lot, and not everyone was charmed by his signature combo of military bluster and dictator vibes. It's also possible, and this is purely me speculating, that Robbins may have had personal beef from his time under Hindman's command. I mean, if someone made you dig trenches, march in circles, and fight losing battles, you might want some revenge too. Anyway, Robbins was arrested, but it didn't last long. By October 10th, the earliest I could find reporting on it, he was acquitted by the mysterious and vaguely defined authorities in Helena, which I'm assuming was a sheriff, 2 deputies, and like, I don't know, someone's uncle named Earl. And after that, nothing. Robbins' name vanished from the news, and that was it for him. But wait, there is still more. Because Robbins wasn't the only person arrested for Hindman's assassination. According to a Chicago Tribune report, and only the Chicago Tribune, which is a little sus, not gonna lie, a drunk man in Memphis supposedly confessed to being connected to the murder months later. A witness claimed he was tried and acquitted, but no name, no trial record, no confirmation, nothing like that was printed. Could this man be Robbins? Unlikely. Robbins was the suspect right away. And this guy came bumbling in with his confession months later, probably after one too many whiskeys and a poor grasp on what don't incriminate yourself means. Honestly, he probably just wasn't interesting enough to have anything to say other than, oh my gosh, I killed General Hindman. So that was it. 2 arrests, 0 convictions. And to this day, the assassination of General Hindman remains unsolved. But hold up, because we are not done. In 1889, Senator James H. Berry got all fired up on the Senate floor while talking about another Arkansas political assassination, also juicy, stay tuned, and casually lobs the accusation that then Governor Powell Clayton might have had something to do with Hindman's death, the same Powell Clayton that Hindman kind of implicated in his own murder in his deathbed speech. Here is what Senator Berry said. Another assassination occurred in Arkansas in the days of Reconstruction. General Thomas C. Hindman was shot down at the dark hour of night through his window in the presence of his own family and his own children. Governor Clayton had control of the entire state government, and yet that assassin was never known, never arrested, never punished. Which is a heck of a thing to say out loud in front of a stenographer. But Clayton, to his credit, clapped back hard. He released receipts showing that as governor, he had issued a proclamation offering $1,000 for the assassin's arrest and $500 for any accessories. That's a lot of cash for 1868. I mean, you could buy like half of Mexico for just $15 million, so this was a lot of money. The paper that ran Berry's speech also published a rebuttal from someone claiming Hindman hadn't even been campaigning for Hanks, which was one of the claims that Senator Berry made, that like maybe because Hindman was campaigning for this guy named Hanks, that Powell Clayton wanted him dead. But the campaign hadn't even started yet by the time of the assassination, so it's impossible for Hindman to have been campaigning for Hanks. It just makes no sense. In other words, maybe Senator Berry should have double-checked his notes on this one. So, what's the truth? Who killed Hindman? Was it Robbins, the Memphis drunk, a political rival, a jilted ex-soldier with a shotgun and a grudge? We will never know. But one thing is for sure. Fake news, political spin, and unresolved murders have been plaguing Congress since long before Twitter. And that, Crimestituents, is the story of General Hindman and his unsolved assassination. Can you help me gavel us out?